Bava Batra Daf Amud Aleph. The fluidity of oral communication, mesapkala tafsinen לשון ראשון or אחרון. This relates to a piece of Gemara we had last July in Masechta Gittin on Daf Samach, where we talked about the difference between information and learning. And that information is having something, you have information, but learning is process. And that Gemara, we got quite deeply into it, and we touch on it again today. And where we touch is not on the core sugya itself that I'm going to spend the time on that we have together this morning, but on an almost side comment that I found by Reb Baruch Sorotskin. Baruch Sorotskin was the Rosh Yeshiva of Telz in Cleveland, Ohio. He was one of the important Chachomim Gedol Israel in the period before the war. Talmud of Rabbi Baruch Ber and Rabbi Chonon Wasserman and others. There's also a kind of a linkage with him because he was a very close chavrusa of Reb Noach Simonovitz. Reb Noach Simonovitz is not well known because he didn't write a lot and he died very young. Reb Noach Simonovitz, though, was the brother-in-law of my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Mishkovsky. He was the founder of Kfar Hasidim, of the yeshiva in Kfar Hasidim, where later Rabbi Lapin went to teach. And so there's a bit of a connection. Also, Reb Baruch Sorotskin was the son-in-law of Reb Avram Yitzchak Bloch. I spoke about Reb Avram Yitzchak Bloch quite a lot over Yom Tov, that tells her off before the war. So it's just important to understand these connections. It's not just a matter of finding something and cutting and pasting from all over. There's a consistent building up, a tapestry of an approach to Torah from a certain school of thought. And Reb Baruch Sorotskin was partially responsible for re-establishing the Telz Yeshiva in the United States. He and Reb Motel Gifter, they married cousins. Reb Motel Gifter married a niece of the Telzerov. And Reb Motel Gifter and Reb Baruch Sorotskin were joint Rosh Yeshivas in Telz in Cleveland after the Reb Motel Katz passed away. And they led the yeshiva then. We don't have a whole lot from Reb Baruch Sorotskin, but on our sugya there's a little comment that's very telling. So briefly, our Gemara is dealing with a case where a person makes a deal and in his wording there is ambiguity. He says one thing and then in a fraction of a second later, he says something else which is not really reconcilable with what he said at first. So now the question is, did he change his mind? Is he expanding what he said before? What is going on? And in these situations, we have to decide, based in Chazal have to decide how we interpret his words. It's not about going back to him and say, hey, what did you mean that time? Because that leaves it too flexible. He can then change his mind. The issue is really what took place when you made that deal. So here we're talking about a case, for example, where a man says, I'm selling you this field, X number of acres, to the centimeter. And then later on he says, plus or minus. Not exactly. So does he mean to the centimeter or does he mean approximately? And there are, of course, differences in how that deal will be executed. And in that case, Barnanas tells us that the last thing he says cancels out the first thing. We ignore the first thing and we go by what he says in the last piece. The Gemara then goes in to say, Rabbi Bar Memel says in the name of Rav, Cholkin alav chavirav al Bernanas. That was Bernanas' view. But the other Chachomim were not sure which is the one we need to go by. And for various reasons, the Rishonim go into what is the uncertainty. The Gemara then deals with a second case where a person's first and second statement are contradictory and how we deal with that. That's a case where a person says, I'm renting you this property. In that case, it was a bathhouse for 12 gold coins per year. That is a dinar a month. And the question is, on a leap year, what happens? Is the 12 an annual amount, and whether it's a leap year, meaning they're 13 months, or it's a regular year of 12 months, he still gets the same amount? Or is he saying, no, in a normal year it's 12, but it's one a month, it's a dinar a month, which means in a leap year it'll be 13, not 12. It could mean either. Which one does it mean? And the case came before Meshumim Gamliel and Rabbi Yossi, and they said, "Yach, look, this could mean all sorts of things. They must divide that extra month. He pays half the rent for Adar Bet, and that's where we leave it." So you see that they don't agree with Ben Nanas, because Ben Nanas would have said, you go by the last thing you said. The last thing you said was, Dinar Zahav L'chodesh, it's a dinar for a month, therefore it means every month you'll pay a dinar, which means 13 dinarim for the year. That's what he said. That was the last thing he said. So we would go by the last thing. The fact that the Chachamim say Yachloku means that they're not sure and they decide to divide the month and split the difference. And then the Gemara says, no, but we can't learn it from there. That's a different case from our case here, because because there you could say he's actually explaining what he meant. There's not necessarily an irreconcilability between the first phrase and the second phrase. The first phrase is 12 dinarim per year. That means he could be saying 1 a month, which means in a 13-month year, it means 13. He could be just expanding and explaining what he's saying. It doesn't mean that there's necessarily a contradiction. Whereas in our case, in the Mishnah, where he sells property to the centimeter, and then he says more or less, that's contradictory. It's either to the centimeter or it's more or less. So the cases aren't comparable. We have a third case, which our Gemara doesn't mention. Tosfos mentions it on the next page. It's from further on, Daf Kuf Samach He. And there the Mishnah says, Katuv bo zuzin mea di'inun sla'in esrin. I owe you 100 zuz, which is 20 selah. The fact is, 100 zuz is 25 selah. So when he writes the IOU, and he says 20 selah, not 25, that's contradictory. The first time he says 100 zuz, that's 25 selah. Then he says 20 selah. Ein lo ela esrin. The Mishnah says, he can only pay 20. Why? So explains the Rashban, because we say, we're not sure what he meant. So the 20 is for sure, it's at least 20 selah, that he said explicitly. Could it be 25? Well, if he wants to claim that, if the lender wants to claim the 25, he will have to prove that the intention, what was actually lent, was 25. So you see from that Mishnah also, that Rav Nanas's view is not unilateral, is not accepted by everybody. That there are some Chachamim who are not sure whether you go by the first, by the second, for all the different reasons the Rishonim give. It's only Ben Nanas who says you always follow the last view. You say you follow what the person said last. So here's where Rebbe Sorotzkin comes in. Rebbe Sorotzkin says, why does the Gemara not prove from that Mishnah on Daf Kuf Samach He that Ben Nanas's Chaverim disagree with him? It's clear from that Gemara Mishnah. You don't have to go, our Gemara goes into a whole discussion. Can you prove it from elsewhere? No, that's different. You can't prove it from elsewhere. That's why Rabbi Abba Bar Memel has to tell us in the name of Rav that Ben Nanas's view is not a unanimous view, that there are those who disagree with it. Ask Rebbe Sorotzkin, but you've got a Mefurish Mishnah on Daf Kuf Samach He. Why does the Mishnah not even mention it? Answers, and it's in the answer that it's really so interesting, answers Rebbe Sorotzkin. ויש לומר דבשטר לא שייך לומר תפוס לשון אחרון, דמיש לומר בעל פה יש לומר דמכיוון שאמר לשון אחרון, מהדר כהדר בי מלושן ראשון. There's a big difference between when somebody is talking and when something is written. When somebody is talking, you can say, well, he wasn't clear in the beginning, so then he continued and explained what he had meant. And he expands the idea, or maybe he changes his mind later on. It's very confusing. It's not clear what he did, because the oral word is fluid. It evolves, it develops, it's alive, it's not rigid. אבל בשטר לקלמם דמכיוון שאמר לשון אחרון שמע מן ההדר מלושן ראשון. But when something is written, you cannot assume that the reason he said the second thing is because he's changed his mind from the first thing. Why can't you assume that? So he writes 100 zuz. 100 zuz is 25 selah. Then he writes 20 selah. Maybe he's changed his mind. No, I don't mean 100 zuz. I mean actually 20 selah. No, says Rebbe Sorotzkin, you can't say that in a document. You can say that in oral speech, but not in a document. Why didn't he just cross it out in the shtar? Why didn't he raise it? Why didn't he put it in parenthesis? Why didn't he write a new document if it's unclear? When something is written, you've got clarity. It's written, it's there. And you can't say maybe he meant this. No, if he meant that, he would have changed it. He would have rewritten it. It is what is written. And the later words don't undo or explain or expand the earlier words. Mashenkin, that's not the case in oral communication. In oral communication, the communication continues to live. It's a live communication. Oral communication doesn't end when the communication's over. One can come back to it later on and develop it further and develop it further. And to understand some of that, going back to the Matmonim in Gittin Daf Samach, where we had the din of Dvarim shebichtav iyatay rashan lomran al peh. It's for that reason that the Torah Sheba'al Peh, Dvarim Sheba'al Peh iyatay rashan lomran bichtav. The Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, should not be written down. Now the Gemara goes on to discuss and says, but nowadays people aren't able to remember everything, they're not able to access everything Ba'al Peh, and so we have to write things down because of Eit la'asot la'Hashem heferu Toratecha. Even if you're compromising the essence of Torah by writing it down, if you have no choice, because the alternative is that it gets forgotten altogether. And we talked in Gittin last year about that idea of Eit la'asot la'Hashem heferu Toratecha. This idea that you don't write down the oral law. The Ran says, there's a Ran in Megillah where he references the Gemara in Gittin, and he says part of the reason is because when something is written down, people stop learning and they start reading. Doesn't that sound familiar to today's society? If it's not written down, you go to a shiur. You listen. You don't understand, you ask a question. You review it when you get home. You realize you've still got a question. You go back to the Rebbe. You ask, or you learn with your chavrusa. You go over the shiur. How did you understand it? You both have different ways of understanding it. You go back to the Rebbe. You clarify. It's an ongoing process of reiteration and development and evolution of Torah, which also ensures that the Torah remains relevant, that it's applied correctly, that it's today's. We've often talked about the freshness of Torah, that it needs to be fresh. The Torah needs to be today's Torah. You can only do that with oral Torah. Once it's written down, it's stale. It becomes rigid and it becomes stale. The difference between dogma and Torah, the reason that we don't have dogma is because we have Torah Sheba'al Peh. The reason we don't have fundamentalism, or shouldn't have fundamentalism, is because we have Torah Sheba'al Peh. These things continue to develop through the ages. It's not rigid in one time, and that's the end of it. That's what Torah Sheba'al Peh is. But once we start writing down, which we have to do, says the Gemara regrettably, but it's heferu Toratecha, you're ruining the Torah by writing it down, but you have no choice. It's better than nothing. But we need to know that as far as it is possible, we shouldn't rely on the written. We should strive to learn Torah that is Ba'al Peh. The Reb Tzadok HaKohen has a thesis throughout his work. Reb Tzadok HaKohen we know as a philosopher and as a Kabbalist, but Reb Tzadok HaKohen was an enormous Talmid Chacham. The Shalos and Tshuvos, in which he has dealings with the poskim of his time, the Shoel and Meishiv with Rabbi Chanan Spector. He was a big Talmid Chacham, and that gives him his authority. And he has a thesis right through. And we've talked about it before, that when you're teaching Torah, there's an energy that comes from the Rebbe through his Rabbeim, going all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, that is channeled through all the generations, and then through the mouth is shared with the people of this generation. There's an energetic communication that takes place, which you don't have when you've just got the words. On the other hand, when you've got the words, as Rabbi Sorotsky says, you've got clarity. He means this. He doesn't mean something else. If he would have meant something else, he would have written the second edition. The fact that this is what he says, that's what he meant. So there's clarity in the written, but there's fluidity in the oral. And the art in Torah is to be able to deal with both of them. I spoke on Shabbos morning at the Medrash a little bit harshly about writing down shortened versions, like the problems even with the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, writing down shortened versions of halacha and it becoming like a Torah shebichtav. Eit la'Hashem heferu Toratecha. We have to do it. It's the right thing to do. We have no choice. We have to, because people don't know. And people know and then they forget. Unfortunately, we have to have these kitzurim. We see these shortened versions, not only of halacha, even of other forms of Torah, Gemara, and shortened versions. We have to do it. You need an art scroll, and you need a mesifta, and you need all the Hels and the Steinsaltz, all the things. You need it. It's a terrible thing that we need it, but we need it, and it's a wonderful thing that we've got it. So we have to be able to walk that narrow line of understanding. We need it. And thank God it's available, and there are people who are making it available, but we should never suffice with it. We should always say, okay, that's great, that's a crutch, happy that it's there, but I'm not lame. I'm healthy. and I want to question more. I want to go into it a little bit more deeply. I want a chavrusa. I want a rebbe. I want to learn this from living Torah, not from Torah, which is only rigid in the written form. So walking this balance becomes a difficult balance to walk, but a very important one. And just in the side comments of Rabbi Sorotzkin, we learn this difference between communication that is written is clear but rigid. Communication which is oral is less clear, but it's open to fluid interpretation and explanation. And hence our Gemara on Daf Kuf Hey can't use the Mishnah on Daf Kuf Samach Hey, because our Gemara is talking about an oral deal, an oral communication, and the Mishnah on Daf Kuf Samach Hey is talking about a document about something which is in writing.